Hi, this is Lex, and welcome to the FinTech Blueprint. It's your podcast about fintech, decentralized finance, digital banking, investing, robo-advice, artificial intelligence, and all the other frontier technology that is transforming financial services. To get more content, like an illustrated transcript of this conversation in your inbox, subscribe at fintechblueprint.com. So without further delay, let's jump into today's episode. Today's podcast is a collaboration with Consensus, the market-leading blockchain technology company. Given its core position in the Ethereum ecosystem, we're able to bring you the most captivating industry insiders, from technologists and entrepreneurs to designers and creatives from all around the world. So join us for inspiring conversations on the future of finance, crypto, and what is making up the new decentralized web. I'm so excited to have Sheila Warren with us today for the podcast. Sheila, welcome.
Thanks, Lex. Great to be here.
Sheila is a fantastic participant in the blockchain ecosystem, as well as an advocate for technology at the global level. She is the deputy head of the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution Network at the World Economic Forum, and will open up what that means and how sci-fi and futuristic it sounds. I'm really excited about this conversation.
Yeah, me too.
Cool. So to start us off, I want to paint a picture of your journey into the space and the various tools and upbringings that you bring to do the work that you do. Can you tell us a little bit about how you started your career and sort of what your initial focus was?
Sure. Well, I started my career, I suppose, as an economist. Undergrad, I focused a lot on development economics, and I was really interested in microeconomics and the psychology of how people make decisions. So I spent a lot of time thinking about that, particularly the developing world. And from there, I decided to go to law school because I found that the combination of psychology and economics and whatnot, law seemed like a very logical profession. It was something that had compelled me for a while. So I wound up in law school. And from there, through a very random, and all of this is just very random path, I wound up being a Wall Street lawyer, which was very unexpected for anyone who knew me, but did make sense given my background in economics, development, finance, et cetera. So I spent a couple years at a firm called Cravath, which worked a lot with hedge funds and PE and whatnot, working on major mergers and acquisitions and tax policy, questions and things like this.
That makes a lot of sense as a foundation. Can I put you on the spot and see if you still remember? Did you take law and economics? Was there a favorite law and economics textbook that you had?
Oh, good God. Did I even take law and economics? I got to be honest with you, I don't know that I did. My law school, I focused tremendously on, critical race theory, employment discrimination. I was very, very concerned about power dynamics in society and thinking about how we level playing fields. So I took taxation. I took quite a bit of tax, corporate tax, this tax. So I think that the tax system really, it incentivizes decision making, particularly by corporations in ways that are invisible to most of the population. But I don't know that I took a law and ec class, funnily enough. If I did, it didn't make that much of an impression. So sorry, whoever may have taught that course.
For me, I also have a law and economics background. And so I remember, I think it was maybe Posner, and then around the time Freakonomics came out.
Yeah.
And, there was all this kind of, it wasn't hype, but it was an excitement about bringing this quantitative approach of microeconomics and utility functions to how people make decisions, and then trying to kind of shove that into court cases. And I feel like until blockchain, that almost fizzled out.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, here's a funny thing, right? We talk a lot about consumer behavior. Marketers look at consumer behavior. But, one thing, I'll just bring up this kind of random example. I was talking to a number of people who were involved in the operations of refugee camps, excuse me, and we were having these conversations around, how do you empower people in these camps to have agency, to think of themselves as citizens, because it's an extraordinarily, as you might imagine, confusing, discombobulating, depressing place to be, having fled, in the middle of the night in many cases with nothing but the clothes on your back. And what they found was that engaging in an ordinary consumer type transaction, like having some kind of wallet and buying a thing, and you get to choose what the thing is, like that provided, I mean, I don't know if this is for better or for worse, you could argue it both ways, this grounding psychologically that was very, very important. And so when we talk about consumer behavior, but the reality is that almost all of us are consumers in some fashion, and the decision-making that we apply in the consumer context often flows into our decision-making within our households, our decision-making in our professional career, et cetera. So this kind of separation. And again, not that we want to commodify everything or think of ourselves only as transactional. Nevertheless, that is such a foundational element of citizen psychology that is something that you got to kind of think about. And I do think that a lot of what we talk about, maybe I'm skipping way ahead to what you want to chat about, but in distributed systems and DAOs in particular, right, really is about having this agency and having this new power in a system in which you ordinarily didn't really have an awful lot.
Oh boy, I will take the bait. It's too good. So I think this is a really powerful point about making a pedestrian choice it's like a biological imperative in the sense that we're not all robot economic agents that are trying to behave rationally, and that's fairly well documented. But we do have an imperative to choose and to make our way through the world and have some sort of set of freedoms that others allow us to have unimpeded. And this is like it's a neurological requirement for mental health. And I guess I wonder what pulled you into thinking about people and refugees and helping others. Kind of how did you go from the hard world of big law towards that?
Well, I have to say that predates my big law engagement, right? Deployment, if you will. I think that the big law was actually a little more out of character for me. I was fascinated by corporate behavior and the personification of corporate entities, right? Both in the law, like that fictitious person that a corporation is, and the way that we assume and assign certain kinds of human behaviors to corporations within the law. It was fascinating to me. And I wanted to really observe that up close and kind of see what that behavior looked like. So that's really kind of why I went over to Wall Street and did that stint over there. But I think that my sort of commitment to social justice and to, thinking about psychology of human beings far predates any of that. And so, in college, I did a lot of sort of public service work. I did a bunch of work around tenancy, helping tenants who were, facing evictions. I did a bunch of small claims cases. And at Harvard Law School, I took a mediation course and wound up being a mediator, which let me tell you, mediating in small claims court as a mediator is an eye-opening view into human behavior and what makes humans tick. And let me tell you, rationality it doesn't factor really heavily into the equation in many cases, right? So you really kind of see some of the pettiness and vindictiveness of people operate in this micro way. And it really did color and change the way that I thought about behavior, about just human behavior. So a lot of that interest is kind of lifelong. I come from a family where I had a very socialist, borderline communist mother who grew up in Kerala, which is actually was a communist state for many years, and a father who is a Republican, So I had these kind of two forces and different ways of thinking about empowerment. One that was kind of like the pick yourself up and do it yourself, and we're all individually responsible, that kind of thing. The other that was like, we have responsibility to each other, and we have to really ensure that, yes, there is an element of personal responsibility, but you have to kind of make sure that there's access to the tools that are needed to help people change their lives. And so I was kind of faced with this at the dinner table, going back and forth, and it was very instructive. And that reflects throughout like most of my family. Like we've got one super, super kind of left side and one much more conservative side, and being exposed to those kinds of different philosophies was really powerful in shaping. The common thread, of course, there is the importance on human behavior, on psychology, on decision-making, on all these different kinds of things that we've been talking about so far.
That would explain how you have the patience to bridge the more conservative elements of governments and regulators to the more anarchist and sort of experimental and rebellious elements of the crypto ecosystem. That the bridge building is sort of from childhood, it sounds like.
Yeah, well, I think that's right. I think the only thing I lose patience for quickly is just blatant selfishness. I tend to benefit of the doubt and kind of assume that people are focused on building a society that reflects what they actually think is the best for the most people. And when that is proven to be false, then I really lose patience very quickly, because I really don't have patience for people who are just in it, to line their own pockets or really want to engage in exploitative behavior and have zero qualms about doing that. But I do find, and I think, I've been around long enough that that's not most people. Most people may or may not have the empathy to understand someone else's context. I do find that in our space, we have a very, very Western view of things, which I find quite problematic on occasion, because a lot of the use cases will actually lead to some of the most widespread adoption are happening in cultures that really do not orient around Western understandings of human behavior, or aren't culturally American. And I do think that it's a big miss on the part of builders to not understand that. But that being said, I think that even those people who kind of exist in that universe are nevertheless, trying to ensure that what they're building is about empowering users, and empowering users in context in the financial services where they really have not had a say in the system, and the system has been stacked very, very deliberately and intentionally, against them. So how can I fault that?
Absolutely. So I want to put some definitional scaffolding down before we go further around some of the things that you've mentioned, and specifically the ideas of a corporation and a person are interesting. We'll probably touch on decentralized autonomous organizations later, but I'd love to understand what is a legal person. And I think within that question, is also the question about society and the law and systems. And you've talked about having systems that are just, that are equitable, that are in some way consistent and fair. Can you root us also in what is society, what is a system, what is the law, and then who are these fictitious agents that behave within it?
Yeah. So, we can start by just kind of taking a hard look at the law itself. And I think that, corporate personhood is a term I think that's used to refer to this ongoing debate within the law, which is the extent to which the rights that we normally attribute or assign to natural persons, namely human beings, should also be afforded to corporations, and that they actually act within a system as part of our society. When you see how this has evolved over time, let's kind of fast forward to the current day. When you have corporations, grabbing brand identity, they have this strong brand identity that kicks off moral or emotional overtones, either sometimes, not even overtones, like just like they hit you over the head with it, kind of in color choice and whatever it might be. And that brand affiliation is given its own life, in a way. And then you have Twitter accounts, right, of a brand, which are functioning like a person and that are often hilarious, I must say, right? But you have people that are tweeting at, an airline. I was about to name one, my least favorite, but I will refrain. People tweeting at an airline to be like, what the hell, man? Or people tweeting at, Comcast or whatever it is, right? As if that's a person. When, of course, there is a person on the other side who's running that account. God bless. That's not a job I would necessarily want. But, they really think of it as tweeting at, if I say I'm tweeting at Comcast or whatever, which I haven't had Comcast in forever, but if I say I'm tweeting at Netflix or whatever, right, to keep my favorite show, do one more episode, I don't know that I pause to recognize that I'm tweeting at a group of people who make decisions for that company about what shows get, a new season or whatever. I kind of think of it like I'm tweeting at Netflix. And a lot of that comes from and is rooted in these kind of early cases around the world. I mean, I think this started in India, actually. There was this court case back there in India many, many, many years ago that was about temples and if they actually were granted legal status for protection, right? If they were granted this kind of immunity to certain kinds of activity and whatnot. And here in the United States, this dates back, I know, to the late 1800s, and I don't have specifics on that. But there were cases that basically said that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment should apply to corporations, which is a really big deal because that was not necessarily the intention when the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were drafted and when the 14th Amendment was passed. Then you kind of fast forward to the present day and you've got all these cases around, do different corporations that have their identity and they have their values that they have established, do they have to, follow things like Obamacare, right? Do they have to kind of provide certain kinds of opportunities or medical care or whatever it is, right? In this case, this was particularly about, I think, contraception and this kind of stuff. Do they have to do that if it falls and goes against their personal beliefs? The Religious Freedom Restoration Act, this was something that came in 1993, tons of case law around this. Do companies that purport to have certain moral values tied to a particular religion, can they be exempted? There's tons of cases about nuns in the United States around this issue, right? Do different orders or convents or whatnot have to follow laws around the provision of healthcare, contraception, abortion, et cetera, that are antithetical to their religious beliefs? And the answer in most cases was no. So when you imagine that a corporation, not just an individual, a corporation or an entity has a religion, it really is not that big of a gap to get to a place where the Citizens United case, which has fundamentally absolutely transformed the nature of the political landscape of the United States, which basically said that corporations should be able to provide essentially unlimited funding for political campaigns and things like this. So these are just the idea of having unlimited political expenditures. That was a First Amendment question, and the First Amendment had not really applied to corporations in this same way. So anyhow, we could go on and on and on about the different examples, but there is a very, very long legacy in the United States of the court siding, particularly in the religious context or in the free speech context, with the idea that a corporation has its own rights that are analogous, and in many cases almost exactly the same as the rights that you and I have as individuals to do certain kinds of things and engage in certain kinds of activities. And the minute you make that leap, then suddenly you are, I think, by necessity, you are including corporations as critical elements and members of our broader society. You're saying our society is not just comprised of individual citizens who are acting, in kind of the friction between them or the consonance among them. You're saying that there are these entities as well that come in and play a critical role in shaping the glue that holds us together and the very fabric. I would say that there's a reason that term is what's used. It's a fabric we all knit together. But these brand entities, these corporate activities, these actions that are taken are a critical part of what is creating that fabric. And they are quite outsized because of the resources that corporations can bring to the table that most individuals cannot.
Super interesting stuff. And I think in particular because it's very real and it's grounded in centuries of decision making. In a sense, you could draw a line towards the Enlightenment and the idea of the rational individual and the supremacy of reason over, the physical body being the thing that lives in the physical world and therefore is the unit of account for intelligence. And out of that, the end result is that these rational objects start to exist, and they start to exist in these substrates of the law, of common understanding, of lots of people thinking that when they're talking to Netflix, they're talking to Netflix, when in reality, their mind is rendering some idea or concept that groups the neurons in the shape of a Netflix counterpart, and then sufficiently many other human beings do the same. And then in our minds, in our collective mind, there's now this superorganism of Netflix, which has power over its employees and access to capital. And of course, I'm just stealing this from Sapiens or from Kevin Kelly's idea of the technium, right? Where you've got these superorganisms with their own utility functions that aren't necessarily super helpful for the individual, for the person, which I think connects back to your earlier point, which is systems that are just and that consider the individual and give them dignity. So can we trace out of this?
Yeah, I was going to say, and I don't think it's a coincidence that the rise of ESG has really tracked the rise of corporation as person, brand as person identity. I don't think that's a coincidence because in the past, when we didn't have as strong a sense of that, we weren't as concerned. I mean, corporations were around to make money. That was their main goal, to make money for their shareholders, to make money for their owners, whatever the structure might be, right? Like that was their mission. That was their goal. Everyone kind of understood that. They provided a good or a service. The utility of that good or service determined how much money they made, which determined how valuable they were in the market, et cetera, right? As you kind of started to elide and erode that definition and bring in this sense that corporations are now part of our society, it is not surprising that then some of the obligations around altruism or sustainability or whatever it is started to bleed in. And we started to get these movements we at the forum called the stakeholder capitalism, right? You got to kind of shift this away from this shareholder extractive model, which had its function, into saying, well, now if you're going to be granted these kinds of rights, these natural person rights, then there's a commensurate responsibility that comes along with those rights. And that I think is manifested as in various forms. But one of them is this kind of ESG movement, which I don't think is at all a coincidence.
Absolutely. I'd love to get to TechSoup, but I have one hanging chad left here, which I think is just the transitions right there to computational blockchains, smart contract platforms as this new emerging substrate for running economic agents or, self-interested agents with built-in property rights and so on. And so we're seeing very quickly all sorts of different types of entities behave and pursue their strange freedoms on blockchain-based networks on Web3, whether they are traditional individuals with open identity or whether they are cartoon frogs who are
Yeah.
hiding behind a bunch of mixers, or whether they are billionaires like Mark Cuban, or whether they are investment syndicates of 99 people to make sure that they can follow the accredited investor laws. How do you think about this new substrate and this new place with DAOs and protocols and so on? How do you analogize that to the systems that we have in place?
So I think of this again as, as an evolution. And I think as we started to assign corporations more and more responsibility, now I should acknowledge that there's definitely friction there. Some people are super opposed to the idea that a corporation should do anything apart from continue to provide economic value to shareholders. So leaving that aside, that debate aside for a moment, but let's just say that I think that the weight of this is now pulled quite more towards the other model, which is more of a corporations have some responsibility, whether it's to the climate or whatever it is. So as you kind of saw that moving, I think that there was more and more awareness that, oh, wait, hang on. Corporations as persons worked for a little while, but now we realize that those corporations actually are headed by persons, like actual natural persons who have limited accountability. There's limited legal recourse against them if decisions are made that are not agreed with by shareholders. And you can often vote with your feet and pull your dollars out and this and that. But, there's an outsized influence by some over others. And to your point about billionaires, right? There's just this very increasing inequity in society. And this is kind of widely known. And of course, has gotten worse during the pandemic. So in my mind, I find the experiment with DAOs, not the DAO, but DAOs themselves, right, to be the most fascinating thing that's happening right now. I mean, kind of full stop, period, full stop. And that's because it's forcing us to wrestle with decisions that we've made, going to your point, way back to Rousseau, the Enlightenment, Hobbes, around how do we want to self-govern? And particularly, how do we want to self-govern a corporate type of entity? Now, whether DAOs or corporations is a whole unsettled area of law, and this is going to be fascinating for legal nerds to follow over the course of the next couple of years. But leaving that question aside, how do we want to self-govern? How do we want to collectively make decisions about corporate-like behavior, about business kind of behavior? And what is the way to try to ensure that we are reflecting the diversity of viewpoints that exist within any particular ecosystem? And so I think this is a natural evolution. Now, the technology, I think that part of it was part of a coincidence. But I think that the political philosophy has been around for quite some time, and there is no doubt a reaction. You can kind of see this, whether it was the Tea Party, whether it was whatever it was politically. There is a lot of consternation, angst, disappointment, and fury, rage and anger about the systems that have been built, the political systems, the economic systems. And I think it remains to be seen whether self-governance, is the answer to a lot of that. I personally am of a mind that I think that there are reasons that our founding fathers, set up the system in the United States the way they did, and it's not a pure democracy or a liquid democracy. I also live in California. Our elections, it's like 4,000 ballot measures. And I'm always like of a mind of like, why am I being asked about this? Like, isn't someone's job to deal with this? So I just think that people come to this differently. But I get pretty annoyed at the concept that people are not capable of engaging in these kinds of decisions and making decisions that are right for them. I tend to find that very paternalistic and patronizing. So I'm going off on a tangent, but this is all by way of saying that, again, I see this as part of the evolution. And I think that as a society, we are experimenting in myriad ways with governance. And that is true on-chain and off-chain, right? And DAOs are just the way that we're doing that in an on-chain, in that kind of environment. But we're certainly doing an awful lot of this off-chain, if you will, and as well in our political systems and otherwise. And if you kind of take the view from Mars, as it were, you can kind of see how all of this is happening similarly in time. And I think that's just a matter of where the code is and what the tech is ready to do is the reason why things are happening, in the tech space versus kind of externally. But the movement is the same and it's all connected.
100% agree with you. We are living in an increasingly computational world. And so it only makes sense that this aspect of it, the political aspect of it, the aspect of power similarly gets integrated into a computational world. And of course, the danger is for agents with very different interests because they're, collective interests through some sort of organization or because of cultural misunderstanding or some sort of artificial intelligence boogeyman, right? With a
Right.
different set of interests entirely to take advantage of this kind of computational layer.
Yeah. And we haven't even talked about AI, right? I mean, and robotics. And that's a whole other thing. We're entering a world where robots are going to have their own Twitter accounts or whatever it is, right? And we're going to personify these coded machines essentially and assign them personhood. And that already kind of happens. I mean, it's kind of the joke around a lot of sci-fi, right? But like that is absolutely going to happen. And we're going to forget very quickly that someone programmed that robot and that person had an agenda and that person had biases, that person had beliefs, that person had a reason, something they were programming that robot for, or that AI, right? They were using a certain data set to create, the algorithm, whatever it is. All of that is coding in our own assumptions about the way the world works. And I think we summarize that as bias. And bias isn't always a bad thing, just to be very clear, but assumptions about the way the world works are limited, because the world works differently for different people in different contexts. And people want the world to work differently based on the cultural assumptions that they're bringing to bear in their own experiences. And that's just kind of a fact. It's just a fact of life. It's what makes us very interesting as a species. That being said, we are going to skip right ahead over some of that awareness. And there's a lot of activity trying to remind people of this and saying we have an obligation, to ensure that we are not baking bias into these systems, et cetera. But it is inevitable. And I am really interested to see what happens when, already you've got the bot wars happening on some of these places. But I mean, in some cases, that's going to actually be humanoid type of entities that we can't necessarily immediately tell the difference, especially at a distance or over a screen. You won't necessarily know, who you're engaging with. And that's true even of chatbots today. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that rabbit hole is both fascinating and also far more along than people realize. So if you touch any part of the internet, you start to see that you're really interacting with sort of these mechanistic fragments of human judgment that has been turned into code and has run away with some particular thing that it's trying to do. And I mean, to me, the numbers are astounding, where something like half of internet traffic is robots trying to game advertising systems. And then if you look at equities trading, for example, the amount of orders that high frequency trading shops create and cancel in order to create a fog through which they direct a real order, is something like 95%. Is just robot orders floating around to create camouflage. And then if you look at all over, right, whether it's image generation or the language that we're reading and so on, I really see us being in a place that is sort of like largely these machine hallucinations.
Yeah.
I think there's, to me, emerging two types of internet. And one is the type of internet that comes from Web 1 and Web 2, which is copyleft. Everything is, you give it away. There's sort of no value in the objects and everything is free and everyone has access, but you make this Faustian bargain with the machine for your attention and for your biology. And you end up, of course, in sort of this feudal environment where everything is free if you're inside of the castle, but the castle is run by one of three machine overlords. And then the other extreme is the sort of Hobbesian kind of hyper-capitalist blockchain architecture where the property rights are, you can't argue, they're inalienable, right? They just are. But then the things that seem to congeal on top of that architecture are very communal. And that's bizarre to me. It's confusing to figure that out. Where's it going?
No kidding. I want to pick up on one thing you alluded to, which is this signal to noise. And so we talk a lot about that, and we sometimes act as if or assume that the noise is incidental, when in fact the noise is often deliberate obfuscation, to your point. And we forget that, I think about this a lot. I use the metaphor a lot of in litigation, there's this thing called a data dump. Okay. So I was never a litigator, so I'm not speaking to my own tactics, but this is, I think anyone who's watched a legal show will be familiar with this, right? The idea that there's one piece of evidence that is going to make the opposing party's case. And you're like, oh man, so what do you do? And you have to follow your ethical and legal obligations. You have to disclose it. You've got to send it over to the other side. And you assume that you're a good actor in that sense, right? You're not going to destroy it or whatever. What do? Well, you just obfuscate it. You send over boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes of data. And I can tell you, junior litigators, what they do at these big firms is they sit in a room and go through boxes and mountains and hordes of data. And now some of that is now done using algorithm, using bots, but a lot of it is still done with human eye, like by hand, if you will. And the chances of you finding that needle in a haystack, the bigger the haystack is, the harder the needle is to find. And there is no reason anyone should assume that that's not what's happening online, because in fact, it is very much what's happening in our online environments. And like you say, in trading and other places, that there are people who understand that the creation of a tremendous amount of noise can actually hide the signal in a way that they can benefit from. And that kind of exploitation is getting more and more commonplace in a variety of contexts. But I just wanted to pull on that thread because I think it's just such an important point. And so part of what we're doing is we're creating, bots to fight bots, right? And the bot wars. And that is, it's not productive, first of all, but it's also really impossible to prove that that's what's happening. And so you kind of get to this place where something I always say is that, transparency is not the end goal in and of itself. We talk a lot about transparency in the blockchain world as if that is like, okay, things are transparent, therefore XYZ. Well, no, because if you're obfuscating and creating a tremendous amount of noise within that transparency, then the likelihood that the actual signal is going to be hidden or misunderstood or misinterpreted is very high. So who cares about transparency if you can't make sense of what is actually transparent? The corollary to that, which I also say a lot and which we explored a lot in a project we did in Colombia a few years ago, is transparency does not automatically lead to accountability, right? You have to have policies in place that indicate what are the consequences of certain kinds of behavior and who has the authority to actually outlay those consequences and to hold people accountable for certain kinds of behavior and to create the proof points and the evidentiary fossil record that kind of indicates that these things have been happening, et cetera. So I tend to get very frustrated by this sort of throwing around transparency as if that in and of itself is solving any particular problem, when in fact it is just a means potentially to an end. And the end, I think, should be accountability and incentivization of, pro-social behavior.
That reminds me of the now silly and somewhat outdated meme about code as law, where showing somebody a couple of lines of code that they can't read because they're not a Solidity developer. I mean, that's not transparency. That's like a religious act rather than anything else. But I guess maybe we take that as a transition to the World Economic Forum and blockchain and your experience there, looking at the blockchain ecosystem now over multiple years. What is the framing that you bring to it? What is the forum trying to accomplish when it brings stakeholders together? And what are the types of goals that you think are feasible?
Well, I think it's probably helpful to go back a little bit and to kind of talk through how I came to be here, because I think that's indicative of the forum's direction. So I was the very first person that was hired into the space at the forum. I was hired to build the team here and run the team and set our point of view and, and kind of set our strategy around how the forum was going to engage. And as a reminder, the forum, we pride ourselves very much on our neutrality. We are ultimately a Swiss organization, and that, brand applies. We are neutral. We are objective. We are not here to pump or hype or detract, right? Like we want to just kind of deal in the facts. And so it's also important to remember, like if the entire crypto ecosystem died tomorrow, the forum would continue because this is not necessarily, critical to our livelihood or existence, right? So it's something that we have I think a unique vantage point in that sense. So we opened up this thing called the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which I now head. But I started off here running we called it the blockchain and DLT platform at the time, or that's what I was hired into. And I come at this whole space more from a Web3 perspective. So prior to the forum, I was at a social enterprise called TechSoup, and I was the chief legal officer there and executive there. And I got very concerned about potential, data breaches. We had very sensitive information on NGOs in various parts of the world, and some of whom the existence of those NGOs in and of itself would lead to, police raids and potentially imprisonment or persecution or even, death in some cases. So I was very concerned about that. And, we're a small social enterprise. We were certainly using what we could afford as best in class, but, we were in no way able to kind of engage in the kinds of protection around data that a lot of big companies could do. At the same time, you had GDPR coming. This was like it wasn't there yet, but everyone knew something was coming. We didn't know what we were going to do. So our CTO and I were trying to think of other ways to really store and protect this data and different cryptographic techniques, et cetera. And so that's how I got introduced to blockchain as a technology. Prior to that, I'd had this whole digital gold, conversation or whatever, which was, I had not connected those things, right? So that's where I came from. And I think it's to the forum's credit that, they could have hired, a cryptographer, someone who just recently left finance, and they hired me, somebody who really came at this more from Web3, who's very interested in and committed to exploration of these systems. And that's who they, after this crazy search, they kind of reached out to me, and that's how I wound up here. And so my entire orientation to this was to say, I want to land that this is real. It's not a fad. There are elements of it that are, this was 2017, dramatically overhyped, at least at the current moment at that time. But there is something here that is going to last. And so I just kind of picked our brand voice as saying, or the first thing I did was publish this paper that I co-authored called Blockchain Beyond the Hype. And it was kind of like, okay, what's real and what's nonsense around this? Because this was the phase of like everything, you attached blockchain to it and got funded, kind of ICO drama, right? How do we kind of articulate what is novel about this and what are the potential applications of it and how could they be useful? And I really do like to think that we help, normalize the technology. So that's something else that I think is very important to how I see my role and the role of the forum is I'm not trying to mainstream crypto. I'm trying to normalize it. I'm trying to say, this is not a scary thing. There are aspects of it that are very real, that are very powerful, and that should be paid close attention to. But it's not necessarily the case that for it to be, quote, successful, every single person needs to be using it in some fashion, like either using digital assets or engaging with a blockchain, although I think that's inevitable, whatever it is, right? It is that you're not a crazy person if you're experimenting in this space. And in fact, companies, many of you are doing it quietly and just not talking about it. So let's just give you the safety and security of a platform to come out and say, yeah, we're checking it out. And look, all of our peers are as well. And I think we were able to provide that safe space, if you will, for people to be honest about what they were looking at. With central banks, there was a lot of reluctance to own the fact that these were experiments happening. They were looking at this technology at all. And we just made that okay to talk about. And so now there's much more transparency to our earlier point about what these different institutions are looking at. So the way I see our role is really, again, it's to say, there are active use cases that are very powerful. There are more that are emerging. A lot of them are centered around people who have been excluded historically from current systems, whatever those systems might be. There is going to be some disruption that happens to some of the big players, especially if they don't kind of come along with all of this. And we can create a much more ecosystem-wide level playing field, right? We can actually do that if we put the right policies into place. It doesn't necessarily mean that every single country needs to be this or that or the other thing. I get frustrated again. I think a lot of what we're seeing in certain frontier economies around the use of crypto is very powerful. And in my mind, if that's where this really stays and becomes really active and takes root, I think that's a huge success. I think if we could level the global playing field in terms of giving a leg up to countries that have been shut out of the global economy, that's incredibly powerful. And it's going to affect the lives of, millions, if not billions of people. Why would that not be a huge success? So, I tend to define success a little differently than our typical kind of capitalist corporate, frame. I think that helps me be effective in my role, or I like to think that's the case. I try as much as I can, I try to really spotlight and highlight these kinds of economies or instances where we're seeing tangible improvements in people's lives because of the use of these assets or this technology or whatever aspect of the ecosystem it might be, and spotlight those and say, just because you're not seeing the pickup in your, super wealthy city and super wealthy country, insert X, does not mean this is not actually a tool that is benefiting an awful lot of people in ways that, are very meaningful to them. And I would like to think that that would be something we can all celebrate as a global society.
That's fantastic. I'm trying to find a way to pull out some of the particulars that you're excited about. And maybe one way to do it is to say, what is I'd say the most real thing that is happening on private permissioned chains that you think stakeholders and, whether they're central banks or financial institutions are really opting into. And then similarly, probably a question around mainnet in terms of, in the decentralized world, if we were to anchor in one thing that you feel is achieving these goals, whether it's people playing Axie in the Philippines and making a living, or whether it's the stablecoin returns or yield or so on. What are some of the things that for you resonate in these different parts of blockchain?
Oh gosh, there's so many, right? I tend to not sneeze at efficiency gains. Now, critical caveat, there's this theory that there's a trickle down. That does not happen. Like, unless you actually construct a policy that ensures that those gains are realized by end users or consumers, it doesn't really happen, right? You stick with the extractive model. I do think that the combination of accountability we're going to see through some form of DAO governance or whatever it might look like, that sort of call for more transparency and allocation of some of these funds realized through efficiency is going to be powerful. So I tend to not sneeze at that. And I think that remains one of the main benefits of the permission systems, right? It's just, you can do things faster and cheaper, and you can reduce intermediaries. You can get access to information that's kind of powerful. So I think that is amazing. And I think that if governments start really harnessing that and auditing, right, in a way, I don't know who would do that audit, but auditing to kind of say like, okay, this is what you're saving. And so how is that actually creating a better experience for your users or customers in a way that's going to be really powerful. I actually think that that's pretty cool. I also think that some of these systems in public-private partnerships, central banks are looking at how they can include. I was on a call with, a whole system this morning where they were talking through, we're really serious about financial inclusion. We understand that we can't just build a new rails. That's not going to really make any sense. And it'll create this kind of parallel system. How do we take advantage of existing payment rails and create a new access point that's going to be very accessible to people that maybe have mobility issues or maybe have whatever it might be, like maybe just don't have the financial literacy or numeracy or have not had access to the existing system. I think that's really interesting. Now, parallel to that, there's so many things I'm incredibly excited about in the decentralized environment, right? I mean, they're more, I would just be honest and say, right? I think that the alternatives to creditworthiness that we can kind of see in DeFi are unbelievably powerful. One of the biggest barriers to intergenerational wealth creation, of course, is lack of access to credit. And credit, of course, is controlled by centralized actors who engage in practices that amount to redlining or exclusion based on statistics that may or may not apply to a given individual or a given family. And so the ability to basically create substituted payment history for credit history to create yield, to kind of do this, I think is incredibly powerful. Now, we have to be very careful because so far, what I think we're seeing in DeFi is just an opening up of a very sophisticated financial system to players who aren't necessarily sitting in a Bloomberg terminal and have, access to some of these kinds of conversations that happen in high finance. And that in and of itself is great, but it's not going to be enough if we stop there. We really do have to think about much more democratic access with meaningful products that are going to change people's lives, that might have very, very small dollar amounts or whatever currency amounts attached to them, but nevertheless are going to be incredibly powerful opportunities and motivators for individuals to create, financial livelihood for themselves. I think that is tremendously exciting. I frankly think that the creator economy, which is the sort of term bandied about, right, as your listeners will know, it is so nascent. We are just at the very, very beginnings of this. And I do think that NFTs are the gateway drug, into that whole creator economy. Whether or not the NFT model winds up blowing up the way many think it will, I'm agnostic about it. I can certainly see it as a possibility, but I also think that what it's opening up in terms of peer-to-peer engagement, in terms of being able to sponsor a particular creator in a more immediate way is really powerful. I think you're seeing this again. This is kind of being mirrored by the ways content's now being created, whether it's the Clubhouse model, whether it's Substack, whatever it might be. There are all these different ways that creators are divorcing themselves from centralized platforms that control their livelihood and censor them, frankly, and moving that into a different environment. And I think that decentralized systems are going to power a lot of that. And I think we're just experimenting all social tokens. There's all kinds of experiments happening. Which of those winds up really sticking and scaling? I'm not the person that's going to make that prediction, but certainly something's going to. There's no question, because that need is acute and there's tremendous demand for it on both sides. So, I'm not going to get into specific examples because I don't like to ever kind of do that necessarily. But, I think that your listeners will be familiar with some of the experiments happening in this space, all of which we are following very closely. And I think that, we're entering this world. This all goes back to sort of my Web3 inclinations, which are a decade old now, which, that is where I kind of see a lot of this moving very, very quickly. And experiments that are happening there, I think, are going to bring people over into the fintech space, even if they don't start there. Because I think that just like me, somebody who wasn't necessarily paying attention to the financial services, kinds of concepts around this as much as the data, I think that is how you're going to bring a lot of people over into digital assets, because they engage with them in a way that is not about finances or about money in any fashion. It's really about data. And then they get comfortable and familiar with the model and then can kind of see how, now I understand how this could make sense in another context. And it isn't this scary thing that I can't possibly ever understand, or that's going to wind up, with me, I don't know, losing my home and my shirt and my family and, being broke and lonely, right? Like, I mean, that's not the end game of all of this. So, but you got to meet people where they are.
Nobody will ever be lonely again if they're in Web3. I've got One last question, which is we're going to make it super complicated, but I feel like that's fair
Okay, let's do it.
land us in the end. One lens to set it up is this distinction between closed networks, kind of like closed loop payment systems, private permission networks, which are becoming the chassis for CBDC discussions or institutional capital markets discussions. And then the open, permissionless, everybody has an Android and some version of Ethereum chassis. And there's also, it seems now to be some sort of geopolitical alignment on that as well. And maybe this is presumptuous, but from one vantage point, you could say that the private permission model is really, yes, there's a lot going on with the West, but within the Chinese model and the digital yuan, there's really an impetus to get that done. And there's an impetus on the blockchain services network to be this kind of extensive architecture along with the Belt and Road Initiative. And then on the other side, end of the day, Ethereum is dollar denominated. It's not Bitcoin denominated. It's not really ETH denominated. It's dollar denominated. And if you look at some of the demographics, like you're still having a lot of the net worth coming from chunky parts of the West. And then there is the rest of the world. And so certainly my dream and the utopia of many people that are building now is to say, we're all going to be open. These things are going to be an internet of blockchains. They'll be permissionless. We'll have a common currency and so on. But at the same time, you do have this overhang now that is the global powers and how they clash. From where you sit, how do you see these actors talking, interacting, and thinking about money, about CBDCs and digital currencies? And then what are the ways that can flip into the sort of internet open world versus kind of a gated garden world that we're trying to avoid?
So I think you have to start with the fundamental examination of what is the role of government, and that it differs around the world. And certainly you could use the US and China as very different models of what the role of government is and ought to be. And those are, without dismissing the very real concerns about exclusion that exist in both societies, American society and Chinese society, which again function very differently. Let's just kind of take those as different models that to some extent are, on some axes, are antithetical. So what is that role? And the role of government is to look out for that nation's citizens. That's just kind of one thing. It's to provide a strong, secure economy. It is to provide for defense. It's to provide infrastructure. Like, it's just kind of these basic things that government provides for its citizens or residents within its borders, right? It is also to create differentiation, and this is just kind of a fact, between that national identity and that of other nations. And that applies whether it is, around the economy and business and certain kinds of innovation and attracting certain kinds of innovators, whatever it might be. That has implications, obviously, for everything from immigration policy to government tech policy and the provision of digital services. And it's also the role, I would argue, and this is where it gets a little bit more complicated, of citizens to look out for every single person who resides within their borders. And, again, their views differ on that, on the responsibility to citizens versus non-citizens, et cetera. But let's just kind of take it as gospel that that's kind of what the role of government is. So the role of government is not to create this massive global system that, works in harmony and every citizen is treated as equal across the entire world. That's not the goal. I would argue that ought to be the goal of the open systems that many of us are passionate about and builders, to your point, are really trying to create. And so there is going to be an inevitable clash between those two agendas. And that's not the fault of anyone. That is just the nature of the entities that exist in the world, and something that we just need to kind of understand. And I think there's a lot of naivete on the part of builders, quite frankly, and those within our ecosystem to this reality, right? And so it's seen as like this pushback and like this desire to not have the system. That's just not the priority. It's not that anyone in the United States government is opposed to an open system per se. It's just that is not necessarily the priority of the actors that are there, particularly in the time of this pandemic when there's a lot of other stuff going on that we'll just kind of put aside for the moment. So when you think about how we shift from one to the other, I don't know that you do that through government. I think that the role of government is to promote, and what we try to say all the time is to promote innovation, particularly innovation that can lead to the betterment of citizens' lives. And whether that's true for all citizens or only their citizens should be somewhat incidental. If there is a benefit to be realized by these kinds of systems, then I think personally, and this is again just a personal view, it behooves, different political leaders and regulators and others to extend, I would think, a pretty, permissive arm to observe what's happening there. And what you see is where there is concern that the opposite's happening, that this is actually leading to exploitation or it's leading to problematic either behavior, either whether that's inadvertent or deliberate and this kinds of things, then I do think that it's unsurprising that government feels the need to step in and remedy that to the extent that they can. And so none of this is out of scope for what these government agencies are tasked with doing. Regulation is an inevitable reality in the world. It's something that we just yell about it as much as people want, but it is not, regulation is not a bad thing. Bad regulation is a bad thing, right? But regulation de facto is not this terrible thing. So fundamentally, what I think we need to be focusing on as a community is saying, here are the real cases where we're seeing improvement, less about potential at this point, more about actual reality. And let's be real, right? There aren't all that many examples that we can really point to, particularly in some of these jurisdictions. We can point to examples outside of these jurisdictions, but we have to really start creating a narrative that is powerful, that indicates what the benefits are. And that's because we have to counter a lot of voices out there from very powerful incumbents who have their own agendas to want to protect systems that the legacy of which has benefited, their corporation as person, to loop back around, very, very effectively, and the natural persons who benefit from that corporate person's rise, right, very, very effectively. And we have to acknowledge that. And so it's really about working together and not letting internal factions distract from the world I think a lot of us would like to see realized, which is one of, to your point, these open systems that provide more opportunity for people, whether that's financial opportunity or whether it's not necessarily quite as literal as that, right? Whether it's just kind of opportunities for engagement, for growth, for connection, whatever it might be, opportunities to monetize things that maybe in the past you couldn't really monetize very effectively, your creations, your data, whatever it is, right? There are all these ways of thinking about that. And in part, I think it's not about seeing government in particular as the enemy, or thinking that we have to adhere to one or the other worldview, again, simplistically positing those as US versus China, but recognizing that it's a third thing. And we have to be committed to that third thing and understand that we are also working within the systems of the other things and figure out how to make all of that coexist. But in my mind, it's heads down, focus on the applications, focus on the benefits, focus on the use cases. And the more that we can do that, the more openness I think you're going to find on the part of governments who, at the end of the day, their goal is to make sure that their nation's citizens are thriving, their economy is thriving, and they are significant players in the global economy. And I think that open systems can lead us directly towards those goals, but we have not necessarily done a great job of making that case, if I'm really blunt about it.
That's a fantastic way to land us and wrap it up. If our listeners want to find out more information about whether it's the publications on the World Economic Forum or connect with you, where should they go?
There's a number of places you can go. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Sheila_Warren. We have the forum has the C4IR has a number of different pages that talk through our projects and things that we're doing. And I do have a podcast on the CoinDesk network called Money Reimagined, where we talk about a variety of these issues and we look at different innovations that are happening and different kinds of things that are happening around the world that help make the case that these are positive developments for global society.
Sheila, wonderful to have you on. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks so much, Lex. It's been a real pleasure.
Hi, everyone. That's it for this week's episode of the FinTech Blueprint. For more technical deep dives into all things fintech and decentralized finance, check out fintechblueprint.com and grab a free subscription to the newsletter. This is Lex, and I'll see you next time.